They said I was a monster, but no one knew the battle I was fighting inside myself. Have you ever stopped to think about how a single word can carry the weight of an entire burden? Sometimes it's not the war that destroys us from within, but the silent judgment that accompanies every step we take when we return home. What happens when the scars aren't on our skin but in our soul? When the pain isn't revealed in visible wounds, but in memories that insist on returning every night? In our dreams, in our silences, in our averted glances. In that moment, I didn't just see shadows around me. I felt like the real battlefield had shifted. It was no longer in front of the enemies I'd faced in the war, but within me, in my memories, in my thoughts, and in the eyes of those who couldn't comprehend the struggle I faced daily. The label of monster felt crueler than any bomb I'd ever heard explode, because it didn't come from strangers in a distant field, but from people close to me, from the society I believed I protected. Have you ever been there? Have you ever carried a weight that no one saw but that seemed to suffocate every breath? This is the story of someone who, marked by the invisible scars of war, was rejected, criticized, and seen as a danger. And it's also the story of transformation, of reconnecting with one's own humanity, of discovering that even pain can become a path to strength. Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you. Imagine for a moment the scene. A soldier returns home. There are no shining medals, no celebration awaiting him. What exists is silence, suspicious glances, and closing doors. His body bears the marks of survival, but it is in his mind that the deepest wounds are etched. It is at this moment that many fail to understand that every invisible scar tells a story. It is not weakness, it is not madness, it is not evil. It is simply pain. Pain that finds no space to be expressed. I remember the first time I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. It wasn't just about my appearance, but about the person I believed I'd left on the battlefield. The reflection felt strange, as if the label others had placed on me had seeped into my skin. Monster. That word echoed and multiplied, convincing me that maybe it was true, maybe I was irreparable, maybe there was no going back. How many of us have believed that, even for a moment? But the truth is that within every pain lies a seed of new beginnings. No one told me this at first, and perhaps that's why it took me so long to understand. But every scar, visible or not, carries not only the memory of a wound, but also the proof that we survived it. And that's precisely where transformation begins, when we stop hiding the marks and begin to understand their meaning. Have you ever imagined what it would be like if, instead of being defined by the labels others place on us, we could be remembered for the battles we've overcome? What you'll hear in this story is more than a personal journey. It's an invitation to look within yourself and recognize that yes, pain can be cruel, but it can also be a turning point, and that's where everything changes. And perhaps as you hear this story, you too remember times when you were judged without anyone knowing what was going on inside you. Perhaps you carried unfair labels, perhaps you heard words that hurt more than any physical wound, and that's precisely why this conversation doesn't have to be just mine. It can be ours. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what has touched you most so far. Sharing your experience, your opinion, or even your feelings can not only lighten the burden you carry, but also help others reading, perhaps feeling less alone when they realize they're not the only ones going through this. And since we're building this space for exchange and acceptance, I want to ask you something simple but very important. Like this video if it has touched you in any way. This quick gesture is what shows the platform that this content is valuable and deserves to reach more people who need to hear messages like this. And if you feel that stories like this touch your heart and want to continue walking with me on this journey, subscribe to the channel. It's your subscription that gives me the strength to keep telling stories that can transform pain into hope, scars into learning, and battles into shared victories. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. It's not just about numbers, but about community, about creating a space where we can all recognize ourselves and, who knows, find the courage to move forward. So comment, like, subscribe, because together we can keep this flame of transformation alive. And it is precisely in this flame that the next part of this story begins to reveal itself. He was still just a boy when he decided to don his uniform and embark for a distant land. A flame burned within him, a deep desire to protect, to serve, to give greater meaning to his own life. For many, that moment felt like the beginning of a heroic journey. His heart beat faster, filled with courage, but also with illusions. He believed that war would be a test of strength, that he would return home worthy of respect, perhaps even admiration. The young soldier saw in that decision a chance to leave behind his insecurities and write a new story, marked by honor and recognition. But reality, as so often happens, turned out to be quite different from what he had imagined. Crossing the line between dream and truth was like falling into an endless abyss. Upon reaching the battlefield, the vivid colors of his ideals turned into a heavy gray, laden with fear and silence. The smell of gunpowder, the deafening sound of explosions, the screams of wounded comrades, none of this was present in the training, the motivational speeches, or the promises of glory. The hidden truth of war is that it is unforgiving, it makes no distinctions, and it leaves deep scars on every life it touches. The first few days were a shock. With every step, he realized that what was human within him was being tested to its limits. He saw friends falling beside him, felt the pain of holding a gun with trembling hands, and discovered how split-second decisions could change destinies forever. The hope that had brought him this far began to transform into a feeling of heaviness, as if he were carrying the burden of the entire world on his shoulders. Still, he tried to hold on, believing that resistance was the only way out. War wasn't just gunfire and explosions. There were also the silent moments behind the scenes, the moments when he was alone, staring into the void. In those moments, his thoughts were more cruel than any armed enemy. He wondered if he could ever be the same again, if there truly was an afterward for those who endure this kind of reality. His warrior mentality kept him going, but deep down, fear was already beginning to corrode his soul. He remembered letters from home, with words of encouragement and love, and clung to them like a plank in a stormy sea. But as the days passed, the feeling of drifting away from his true self only grew. It was as if each revelation from the battlefield erased a little more of who he had once been. The young man who dreamed of returning a hero was beginning to realize that the real challenge would be simply making it back. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what no one tells you is that war doesn't end when the soldier leaves the front. The invisible scars continue to haunt him, shaping his thoughts, affecting his decisions, and transforming his outlook on life. The psychological impact, the weight of memories, and the constant feeling of being on alert are silent battles that don't appear in medals or official speeches. The truth is, the return can be more cruel than the combat itself. The first time he set foot home after months of struggle should have been a relief, but instead, it was like crossing an invisible border, carrying a burden no one around him could understand. The familiar streets seemed strange, the familiar faces sounded distant. He felt like a stranger in his own life. And in the silence of ordinary days, a new kind of pain began to emerge, the pain of finding nowhere to fit in. Those around him expected a strong man, an example of courage. But behind his gaze lay deep scars. His mind still echoed the sounds of the battlefield, and with every crack, every unexpected noise, his body reacted as if he were back in that hostile territory. This duality between appearance and reality became a constant torment. It was like living in two worlds at once, the present, where everyone seemed to be moving forward, and the past, which insisted on imprisoning him. At that point, the label monster began to appear, not because he had committed atrocities, but because his demeanor had changed. People didn't understand his silences, his fears, his unexpected reactions. The looks filled with distrust were as painful as any physical wound. Society wanted the hero, but rejected the man who returned, broken inside. This rejection was like a second war, even more difficult to face. And it is precisely here that the story becomes a mirror for so many others, who even outside the battlefield also face cruel judgment and misunderstanding. Because, deep down, we're not just talking about soldiers. We're talking about anyone who has ever carried invisible pain, who has ever been unfairly labeled, who has had to fight inner ghosts while the outside world had no idea what was happening. This is the part of the journey where transformation and mindset become crucial. It's the choice between succumbing to the weight of words or finding the strength to carry on. It's in this invisible thread between pain and new beginning that everything begins to change. Every detail, every memory, every revelation can become a turning point. But before I move on, I want to open a space for connection with you, who are listening now. If this story resonates with you, comment below. That makes sense to me. The marks he bore from the war weren't just a few scratches, cuts, or bruises. What truly remained were memories that wouldn't fade. like endless echoes that insisted on repeating themselves in his mind. At night, nightmares became constant companions. He would wake up sweating, his heart racing as if he were still in the middle of the battlefield. Often he couldn't tell if he was dreaming or reliving reality. His body reacted, his breathing quickened, his muscles stiffened. It was as if the past had found a cruel way to infiltrate the present. With each louder noise, each unexpected crack, fear took over. Everyday situations, simple to anyone, became triggers capable of transporting him back to the scene of destruction. Going to a supermarket, walking down a busy street, or simply hearing fireworks was enough to trigger memories he no longer wanted to confront. This was the hidden truth. The war hadn't ended when he returned home. In reality, it was on this return that the most difficult, silent and solitary battle began. Anxiety became a constant shadow. He found himself on constant alert, as if an attack could strike at any moment. This hypervigilance drained his strength because there was never room to relax. His body was in a state of combat, but the world around him had already moved on, and it was in this contrast that a feeling of rejection arose, as if the place he once called home was no longer his. The strange looks, the snide comments, even the silence of those close to him were reminders that for many he no longer fit in. The invisible scars were, in some ways, more cruel than any physical wound. Because while wounds on the body can be treated, wounds on the soul remain open, bleeding from within, unseen by anyone. He wondered if he would ever feel normal again. The feeling was of being split in two. On one side, the man everyone could see. On the other, the soldier who still carried the war in his eyes, heart, and mind. It's curious how society creates an expectation of unshakable strength. Many wanted him to be the resilient hero, always ready to smile and show gratitude for having returned alive. But the reality was different. The hero everyone idealized felt, inside, shattered. This contradiction generated even more pain. How can one explain that every victory achieved on the field was accompanied by irreparable losses? How can one say that behind a uniform there was a human being who also cried, who also felt fear, who also broke? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding invisible scars means recognizing that they don't just belong to those who have been to war. They manifest in people who have experienced trauma, rejection, loss, and pain that no one else can see. They are silent marks that shape mindsets, influence decisions, and often prevent someone from believing in themselves. This truth, hidden behind the scenes in the lives of so many, reveals that we are not talking about just one soldier, but a human portrait that echoes across different stories. It's at this point that the journey begins to transform into something bigger. It's not just about survival, but about the search for meaning, about trying to understand how pain can be used as fuel to move forward. The impact of living with invisible scars goes beyond personal experience. It invites us to reflect on how we judge others, how we react to behaviors we don't understand, and the need for empathy in a world that insists on demanding only results and appearances. And it was on this path that his life began to take on a new shape, albeit uncertainly and painfully, because every scar, however harsh it may seem, also carries a revelation that there is still life after the fall, there is still light even in the midst of darkness. The soldier everyone called a monster was, in fact, struggling to rediscover his own humanity. If this part of the story touched something inside you, write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. Words always carried weight, but never more so than in that moment. They called him a monster, as if the war had stripped him of every trace of humanity. They said he was dangerous, as if every silence were a threat. And some went even further, murmuring that he was beyond salvation, as if his life had lost the right to begin again. These phrases became open wounds, invisible but deep, because they came not from enemies, but from people who should have welcomed him. The soldier who left believing he was fighting for his people was now seen as someone everyone should keep their distance from, and it was at this point that the loneliness became unbearable. It wasn't just the weight of memories, but the emptiness all around. Friends who once walked beside him now crossed the street to avoid seeing him. Family members, unable to understand his mood swings and lost gaze, began to treat him as if he were a stranger in their own home. And worst of all was the collective silence. No one asked what he felt. No one wanted to hear the truths hidden behind the scenes of the war. No one dared enter that territory of pain that seemed unreachable. The result was a growing chasm between him and the world. Social exclusion often weighs more heavily than any battle fought on the front lines, Because when you're at war, at least you have clarity about who the enemy is, where the danger comes from. But upon returning, the enemy becomes invisible. It's prejudice, distrust, and hasty judgment that wounds without the person realizing it. And every sidelong glance, every whisper behind his back, reinforced the idea that perhaps it really was what they said. After all, how can you fight an accusation that can't be proven or disproved? The hidden truth is that often the label imposed by society doesn't speak to who we are, but to the fear others have of facing reality. Calling someone a monster is a way of distancing oneself from the pain one doesn't understand. It's easier to point fingers than to allow oneself to empathize. It's simpler to judge than to listen. And all the while, the soldier became increasingly lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, trying to find answers to questions no one dared ask. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because social judgment affects not only how we are seen, but also how we come to see ourselves. It's like a distorted mirror. The more rejecting looks we receive, the more we believe we are exactly what they say. And this is one of the greatest impacts on the mindset of someone who already carries invisible scars. It's not just the trauma of the past, but the cruel confirmation that the present offers no shelter either. This exclusion generates desperate decisions, pushes people down paths of self-destruction, and reinforces the idea that there is no going back. And yet, paradoxical as it may seem, it is precisely from this point of rejection that the spark of transformation can emerge. When everything around us pushes someone to the bottom, there are two choices: surrender to the darkness or find a small flame to resist. This truth doesn't appear in speeches or official reports, but it is the revelation behind many stories of overcoming adversity. The soldier everyone called dangerous still harbored within him the desire to live, still carried, albeit hidden, the hope that it wouldn't be too late to start over. And this hope, however small, was what kept his feet moving, even if staggering, even without clear direction. Because in the end, the greatest battle was not against others, but against the loneliness that grew like a shadow. And it was in this silence that he began to realize that if there was no welcoming space around him, he would need to create a space within himself to endure. If what you've heard so far touches something in you, comment below. That makes sense to me. There was a moment when everything seemed to fall apart at once, not amidst the explosions of war, nor during armed clashes, but in the heavy silence of an ordinary night, already at home. The soldier, who had already been called a monster, dangerous and beyond redemption, began to believe those words were true. He looked at himself and could see nothing but darkness. His mind, tired of fighting the memories, began to whisper that there was no way out, that any attempt at a new beginning would be nothing more than an illusion. It was as if the ground had opened up beneath his feet, and he was falling into a bottomless pit with no one around to lend a hand. The pain he felt was no longer just emotional. His body felt like it was carrying tons of weight. Every step was an effort, every morning a challenge just to get out of bed. The emptiness had set in so deeply that even the simplest things lost their meaning. The food was tasteless, the places that once brought him peace became unbearable, and even the silence that could have been rest was now a space where the screams of the past echoed louder. The war was no longer outside. It had settled inside him, and at that point it seemed he had won. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been through it, but rock bottom isn't just sadness. It's a mixture of hopelessness and abandonment, as if one's very identity had been ripped away. The soldier looked in the mirror and no longer saw the young man who once believed in purpose and honor. In his place, he saw someone unrecognizable, lost, broken. And most cruelly, this feeling made it seem as if nothing he had done before had any value. The sacrifices, the efforts, the lost comrades, everything seemed to dissolve in the face of that inner darkness. At such times, the mind begins to create traps. He questioned every decision, every step taken. Had it been worth it? Did all that suffering have any real meaning? What remained were painful revelations, glimpses into a life that had seemingly lost its thread. The hidden truth is that in the midst of despair, human beings can become their own executioners. The soldier blamed himself for not being strong enough, for not living up to expectations, for not being able to simply move on, as many told him he should. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it's at this breaking point that many give up, that many surrender. But at the same time, it's also at this point that something new can be born. The impact of reaching the limit is brutal, but paradoxically, it can also open space for transformation. When there's nothing left to lose, when the fall seems complete, the possibility of rebuilding from scratch can arise. Not because it's easy, but because the mind understands there's no other choice but to fight in a different way. Rock bottom is frightening, but it's also a place of revelation. It reveals without masks, without illusions, who we truly are when everything is taken from us. For the soldier, this moment was marked by silent tears, sleepless nights, and thoughts he would never dare confess. But it was precisely there, in the greatest vulnerability, that something began to move, as if the extreme pain had opened a crack, a tiny space through which an almost invisible light could shine. And though he didn't know it yet, this would be the beginning of a new journey, one that was no longer about surviving the war, but about surviving himself. If you understand this feeling of falling, of believing there is no way out, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." It was when he believed nothing would make sense anymore that something unexpected happened. It wasn't a grand movie twist, nor an epic scene of salvation, but rather an almost imperceptible detail that lit a flame within him. Sometimes transformation begins subtly, in a small gesture, in a word spoken at the right moment, in a presence that emerges when everything seems to be falling apart. For the soldier, this encounter was like a breath of life in the middle of the desert. He hadn't expected it, hadn't sought it, but he was surprised by a simple revelation. There were still people willing to see him beyond the scars, beyond the label, beyond the stigma. This person didn't see him as a monster, but as someone broken who needed to be heard. It was in a seemingly ordinary conversation that the soldier felt something different. There was no judgment in the look, no rush in the answers, no fear in the silence. For the first time in a long time, he could speak without fear of condemnation, and it was in this listening space that a spark of hope was born. It wasn't the definitive solution, it didn't erase the past, but it revived the idea that perhaps he wasn't as alone as he thought. We often underestimate the impact of a welcoming word, an outstretched hand, a genuine presence. What happened to him reveals a hidden truth. Sometimes turning points don't come from big decisions, but from small encounters that remind us of who we are. That conversation awakened in him the memory that there was still life pulsating, that the possibility of transformation still existed, and that was enough for him to take the first step towards something new. It's curious how mindsets can change when a glimmer of hope opens. The soldier, who previously believed himself a lost cause, began to see a new perspective. He still felt the weight of memories, still carried the invisible pain, but within him arose the resolve not to give in so easily. From that moment on, each day ceased to be merely a fight against the darkness and became a search for small lights. This change didn't eliminate the ghosts, but it gave him the courage to face them. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because true transformation doesn't happen suddenly, but is born from those moments when a new vision is awakened. It was from this encounter that he began to realize he didn't need to carry the burden alone, that there were alternative paths, that life could have a meaning different from the one pain tried to impose. The impact of this revelation was so great that even amidst the falls and relapses, he could no longer shake the idea that a new beginning was possible. His journey took on new meaning, and that small flame became the beginning of a broader quest. He began to notice details he'd previously ignored: the value of a sincere hug, the power of a word of encouragement, the importance of believing in something greater than pain. And so, step by step, his will to live began to be rekindled. He wasn't saved. He still had a long way to go, but he had already found the thread of hope that could guide him. If this part of the story touched something in you, comment below. That makes sense to me. Rebuilding didn't begin as a grand gesture, but as a silent agreement with the dawn itself, getting up even if you didn't feel like it, and choosing a single gesture that would bring you a little closer to life. On the first day, it was simply opening the window and letting the air in. On the second, writing down in a notebook 3 things that hurt, and 1 tiny thing that was still worth fighting for. On the third, walking for 15 minutes without headphones, just to hear the sound of the world and remember that there was movement beyond your torment. None of this was easy, nor quick. There was no magic. There was discipline, and the repeated, almost stubborn decision to respect micro-victories that no one would applaud. The hidden truth of change is that it feels less like a trophy and more like a sequence of invisible steps, repeated until they become a path. Therapy arrived like a beacon when he still couldn't name the waves. The first sessions were uncomfortable. Talking about what he'd avoided for so long hurt. Touching on memories seemed to reopen wounds. But right there, Behind the scenes of that simple office, the revelations began, the triggers that threw him back onto the battlefield, the defense patterns that became a prison, the habit of blaming himself for everything beyond his control. The therapist didn't offer shortcuts, he offered tools. They taught him to recognize signs, to breathe before reacting, to ask himself, what's alive in me now, instead of what's wrong with me. And when relapses arose, because they did, the rule was not to turn a stumble into a sentence. He learned to start over the same day, not on Monday. The new habits arrived like bricks that, when aligned, built a minimal structure to support the mind. A sleep routine, with the ritual of turning off screens, hot tea and slow breathing. A simple diet to stabilize a body that was constantly on alert. Physical exercise without heroism, just enough to remind him he still had strength. Clear boundaries with people and news that increased anxiety, and above all spaces of intentional silence where he could listen without fear to what his soul was trying to say. On that journey, he discovered that discipline isn't rigidity, it's care. Some days courage means running 3 miles, and other days the greatest bravery is taking a shower, changing clothes, and making the bed. Each decision adjusted his mindset, repositioning him a millimeter beyond the pain. The right support made the difference. It wasn't the crowd, it was a small hand-picked circle, the person who listened when no one else would, a former colleague who understood the language of pauses, a support group where no one asked, "Why don't you just get over it?" Because everyone knew that getting over it isn't about erasing, it's about learning to carry on without breaking. In this environment, the soldier stopped being the problem and became someone in process. And that changes everything. The label that once reduced him to a label was replaced by a more honest perception. There was pain, but there was also a desire to live. There were wounds, but there was also a desire to serve. There was fear, but there was a decision not to hide. At first, the progress was almost imperceptible. One less nightmare a week, a difficult conversation conducted without outbursts, an entire afternoon without feeling in danger. Small metrics that, written down in a notebook, took on the weight of a map. He began recording the moments when he managed to choose differently, when he breathed instead of reacting, when he asked for help without shame, when he said no to protect his own sanity. These seemingly trivial notes became personal revelations, tangible proof that transformation was underway, even when it felt stagnant. Because sometimes the real impact happens beneath the surface, in a subterranean where roots grow silently. There were days when chaos tried to reclaim him. The mind is skilled at reenacting old scenes. The body anticipates dangers that no longer exist. On those days he activated his emergency protocol, a message to someone close to him, a short walk outdoors, water on his face, 5-minute stretches, music without lyrics, deep breaths with counting. Simple rules pulled him back to the present, and when the past persisted, he repeated a phrase he learned in therapy. What was dangerous is no longer present. With each repetition, the nervous system received the message. With each repetition, history shifted a little, making room for new possibilities. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because rebuilding isn't a linear roadmap. It's a mosaic of daily choices whose beauty only emerges when we step back a bit. There's a point where self-care stops being about survival and starts becoming direction. He realized this when one habit led to another. Better sleep opened up space for clearer thinking. Mental clarity facilitated difficult conversations. Honest conversations strengthened bonds. Bonds of trust reduced relapses, and fewer relapses freed up energy to try new things. Like a domino effect in reverse, the pieces rose until they formed a structure, purpose. This word seemed too big at first, but it began to fit him when the past stopped being an enemy and became a file of instructions. He understood that his scars weren't a resume of pain, they were a repository of understanding about what others also go through in silence. And here a subtle shift in mindset occurred. Instead of asking, "Why me?" he began to ask, "How can I use what I've experienced to ease someone else's path?" This decision didn't erase the suffering, but redirected his energy. Pain became raw material. What was once a burden became a tool. To sustain this, he created an agreement with himself, almost an intimate code of conduct. He wouldn't romanticize relapses, because they're part of the process. He wouldn't compromise on the basics: sleep, food, movement, conversation. He wouldn't heroize solitude when what he needed was people around. He wouldn't measure progress by the day's mood, but by the week's consistency. He wouldn't use past labels as prophecies, but rather as reminders of who he no longer wanted to be. This set of discrete decisions served as rails. If he ever fell off track, the rail was still there, ready to put him back on track. Over time, the notebook became an archive of revelations. He began recording questions that guided him. What's calling for courage today? Where is my anxiety trying to protect me but overreacting? What's the smallest action with the greatest impact right now? These questions reassembled the day when everything threatened to go wrong. And curiously, the stronger he grew internally, the less noise he needed to make externally. Real change never needed a megaphone. It breathed in the steady rhythm of a life that was once again fitting within its own body. Therapy, which began as a crutch, became a laboratory. He and his therapist tested strategies, revisited beliefs, and identified inherited patterns, not to find blame but to create accountability. Instead of fighting their minds, they learned to train them. Instead of denying emotions, they practiced naming them, so they would lose their power to rule in the darkness. And when the nightmares diminished in intensity, he realized something he hadn't noticed before. He no longer woke up every day at war. Sometimes he opened his eyes and felt a silence that didn't frighten, a silence that felt like space. This new space was filled with small but meaningful experiences, cooking his own food and eating slowly, calling to say thank you, not just to ask, visiting a place that scared him, and staying a minute longer than he would have otherwise, reading 2 pages of a book and underlining a sentence that spoke to his soul, writing letters he would never send, just to give voice to what was stuck inside, putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle as a visual metaphor for what he was doing inside. Small practices gave texture to the day, and a textured day weathered the storms better. None of this made him immune. The world remained noisy. Demands continued to appear. Society still insisted on easy labels. But his armor changed. It stopped being a shell of hardness and became a set of habits that kept him flexible. And flexibility, he discovered, is more valuable than hardness when the goal is to remain whole. After a few consistent weeks, what seemed distant happened. A friend asked for advice, someone younger than him sought him out for a conversation, and without realizing it, he no longer spoke from the perspective of someone who only suffers. He spoke from the perspective of someone who has learned the ropes. There's one detail worth highlighting. The impulse to give back to the world what he'd received began before he felt ready. No one feels completely ready. Readiness emerged as he walked. By sharing a breath that worked, a phrase that calmed, a practice that anchored, he found a voice. And a voice, when it finds its purpose, also finds direction. The impact of this isn't measured in audiences, but in relaxed gazes, in lowered shoulders, in hearts that remember we are not alone. Rebuilding, therefore, wasn't a straight line. It was a spiral. With each turn, he rediscovered familiar spots with a little more awareness, a little more resourcefulness, a little more peace. And it's in this spiral that the next stage begins to unfold almost naturally, like someone realizing that the path that saved their life can, little by little, open paths for others. If this part of the story resonates with you, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." What had once been mere pain began to transform into raw material for something much greater. The soldier, who had been called a monster so many times, realized he could use the very thing they tried to throw at him as a bridge to reach others. Instead of hiding his scars, he began to display them, not as trophies, but as maps. Each wound became a lesson, each painful memory a warning sign that could guide others going through similar torments. The hidden truth he discovered is that when someone has the courage to expose their vulnerability, they open space for others to allow themselves to be human too. The impact of this decision was profound. People who had previously looked at him with fear began to see him as a role model, not because he was perfect or had overcome everything linearly, but because he spoke from real experience, unfiltered, without hiding the behind the scenes of his journey. He said, "Yes, I know the pain. Yes, I know what it's like to lose faith in yourself, but I also know that it's possible to get back up, even if it's one step at a time." This honesty generated authority because it came not from theories, but from experience. His mindset, shaped in the fire of rejection, now inspired those who felt crushed by the weight of their own labels. He began to become a kind of mentor without realizing it. First, by advising a friend going through a silent crisis. Then he was sought out by young people who saw in his story a chance to learn how to face their own ghosts. and little by little, his journey ceased to be just about survival and became about transformation. What was once synonymous with shame became a space for shared learning. His revelations, born in chaos, gained strength like seeds planted in other hearts. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a detail many don't see. Pain, when transformed, generates an almost indestructible force. Anyone who once believed they were at rock bottom and managed to find a way back carries within them a rare understanding, a clarity about what truly matters. This is how the soldier began to see his own story, not as a burden, but as a legacy. The label of monster lost its meaning, because now he was seen as someone capable of guiding, of showing possibilities, of opening doors of hope. This turnaround didn't happen overnight. It was the result of countless decisions, of setbacks transformed into learning experiences, of conscious choices made behind the scenes of daily life. But precisely because it wasn't easy, it gained even more value. With each person who found a little peace listening to his words, he realized that nothing had been in vain. Every tear, every crisis, every sleepless night became a brick in the bridge that now supported the crossing of others. The greatest revelation was understanding that his suffering didn't have to end in silence. It could echo as a guide, and perhaps this is precisely what inspires him most in his journey: the courage to transform invisible scars into visible lessons. He didn't erase the war he lived through. He didn't deny the judgment he suffered, but he chose to reframe each part of the journey. This decision changed everything. The one who had been rejected as dangerous and unsalvageable was now sought as a reference for overcoming, not because he had all the answers, but because he was living proof that pain can be overcome, and more than that, can become fuel for creating a positive impact in the world. If this change also speaks to your life in some way, comment below. That makes sense to me. Perhaps you too carry invisible scars. Maybe they're not marks of war, but memories of harsh words, silent rejections, failed choices, or losses that left a void hard to fill. Sometimes the world looks at you and sees nothing but normalcy, but inside, there are battles no one imagines. And it's precisely in this secret space that pain settles, like a shadow that insists on following every step. But I want to tell you something the soldier discovered firsthand. Your pain can be the beginning of your transformation. It's not easy to believe this when everything seems so heavy, I know. Your mind screams, your heart bleeds, and you feel like you'll never find a way out. But within this chaos, there's also a hidden truth. Scars aren't signs of weakness, but of survival. Every sleepless night, every tear swallowed in silence, every time you thought about giving up and yet took a deep breath and kept going, all of this shows that there's still strength within, even when you can't recognize it. This revelation is powerful because it changes the way we see ourselves. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because perhaps the great turning point isn't waiting for the world to recognize your struggle, but in you yourself, beginning to see that the scars you bear can be used differently. The soldier, called a monster, found in his suffering a raw material that became a lesson, and that's what each of us can do. Take what seemed like condemnation and transform it into a guide, a map, a beacon for the dark days. This decision isn't born ready-made, but is built step by step when we choose not to let pain be the end of the story, but rather the starting point for a new journey. Our mindset changes when we understand that the impact of our wounds doesn't have to be limited to suffering. They can generate empathy, they can create connection, they can open space for others to feel safe sharing their own struggles. This is how loneliness begins to fade. Because when you speak from the truth you've lived, you create an invisible bridge to reach those who may have believed there was no longer a chance. The soldier discovered this when someone truly listened to him, without judgment. And this same experience can happen to you when you choose not to stifle your pain, but to give it a new purpose. Every time you face your own shadows and still decide to walk, you show that transformation is possible even amidst chaos. It doesn't matter if the step is small, if no one around you recognizes it, if you still feel fear. The journey isn't measured by the absence of pain, but by the courage to continue despite it. And when you understand this, something inside you changes. You stop being someone who simply survives storms and start being someone who learns to navigate them, using the revelations of the past as a compass. If after listening to all this, you feel that this message is also for you, comment below. That makes sense to me. It's not the scars that define who we are, but what we choose to do with them. This was the most powerful revelation of that soldier's journey. He understood that the marks he bore didn't have to be reminders of defeat, but signs of resilience, silent witnesses that he had endured what many couldn't. And deep down, this applies to all of us. Every pain we face, every rejection, every night when it seemed impossible to carry on, can become the raw material for a new story. The difference lies in the decision we make in the face of what we've experienced. Either we let the wounds imprison us, or we use each one as stepping stones to build something greater. It's curious how life sometimes presents us with choices that seem small, but have a huge impact. The soldier could have forever believed in the label of monster, could have surrendered to the weight of judgments, and lost himself in the darkness. But he chose another path. He decided not to allow his identity to be determined by the eyes of those unfamiliar with his struggles. This shift in mindset didn't erase the pain, but it gave it new meaning. It's like saying, yes, I was wounded, but I am not just my wounds. I am what I do with them. This is a revelation that can transform any journey, including yours. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because perhaps you too need to remember that your scars are not condemnations. They can be guides, reminders, even symbols of a strength you haven't yet fully recognized. The hidden truth is that we often spend too much time trying to hide what broke us, when, in reality, that's precisely where the opportunity to inspire and transform lies. The soldier, once rejected, discovered that his greatest authority came not from perfection, but from shared vulnerability. And that's what can happen to you. What today feels like a burden can become purpose. And if this story spoke to you, if at any point you saw yourself in these words, I want to invite you to do something simple yet powerful. Like this video because it shows that this message matters and needs to reach more people. Subscribe to continue walking along this journey because each new chapter brings reflections that can further strengthen your transformation process. And share this video with someone who needs hope, because we never know how much a word, a story, or a truth can change the course of another life. I'd love to hear from you. What scar in your life have you managed to transform into strength? Comment below, because your story could also become a light for someone in need. If you've made it this far, it's because this message in some way resonated with you, and I want to thank you for sticking with me until the end. This shows that within you lies the same search for meaning, transformation, and strength that guided every word I've shared here. So take advantage and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving content like this, which isn't just stories, but reflections that can change the way you see your own scars. Also leave a like, because that shows we're truly connected on this journey. And do one more thing, comment on the sentence, I'm with you until the end, just so I know who walked with me until the last minute. It will be special to see who was with me on this journey. And if you want to continue diving into this topic, there's a video right here that complements it. Click and stay with me there, because our conversation isn't over yet.